Today in the EU, VDL on tightrope, obliging the right without losing the left. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen faces a tricky dilemma, as she will have to woo right-wing voters without scaring away the left-of-centre parties, whose votes she needs to win her second term. But what does keeping the balance look like for Ursula von der Leyen, and how is she really going to get the best of both worlds? Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori, and this is Today in the EU. To get a better understanding, we invited Nick Alipour, Euractiv's Berlin-based politics reporter. Nick, there has been a lot of discussion and attention on Ursula von der Leyen's run-up for a second term, particularly her focus on gaining support from both ends of the political spectrum. But why does she even need to strike a balance between the left and the right?
Well, the reason is that during the campaign, obviously the EPP wants to maximize their seats in the European Parliament, because the more seats they have, the more able they will be after the election to push through their policies. And so they need their voters, which tend to be more right-wing. That's that. But then on the other hand, they also need votes to von der Leyen's left to get through the final investiture vote in the European Parliament if the EU leaders decide to pick her as their candidate for a second term. And then it won't be enough for her to just rely on right-wing parties, because there's not enough of them, as it looks at the moment. So she will need votes to her left, meaning a difficult balance. She can't scare away the left, and she cannot lose the right.
And how is she really going to get the best of both worlds?
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure that she knows exactly herself. At the moment, it's shaping up to be basically a parade of buzzwords. So she's dropping on one hand during the campaign, her and her party, a lot of very right-wing friendly terms, such as, we're going to cut red tape, we're going to make Europe more competitive, we're going to have a new defense commissioner. So basically playing very much to the instincts of a right-wing audience, but at the same time embedding it in a very Euro-friendly narrative of being like, we're doing all this because we're against the Le Pens in Europe, we're against the Polish PiS, we're against basically all these very right-leaning forces.
And Ursula von der Leyen has highlighted her pro-European narrative many times.
The cutoff line is, do you stand for democracy? Do you defend our values? Are you very firm in the rule of law? Are you supporting Ukraine? And are you fighting against Putin's attempt to weaken and divide Europe? And these answers have to be very clear.
She said in a speech in February for her second-term bid, where she pledged to collaborate exclusively with pro-European, pro-NATO, pro-Ukrainian and unequivalent advocates of EU democratic principles.
So at the moment, it shapes up to be a balancing act in her rhetoric, and let's see how successful that's going to be.
Now, much of the talk is directed towards her pulling back on her Green Deal flagship plan, which sparked real criticism, especially on the more progressive side. So what is happening there?
Frankly, to be honest, something that has been talked about a lot during this campaign and running up to the campaign, but we haven't heard much about specifically rolling back policies, other than the very controversial phase out of the combustion engine cars by 2035 in the EU. So for the moment, it sounds like there's a lot of talk, but is anything ever going to happen? That's still up in the air, as so many things are with this campaign, because the initial demand to roll back the phase out of combustion engine cars, that one was actually scrapped by the EPP. So it seems that we will hear a lot of things and a lot of talking points about making Europe competitive and, not being so green anymore. But I'm not sure that we'll end up actually seeing many of those policies reversed, even though the left is warning of such a scenario already. The Green Left candidate recently said the CDU and the EPP, they want to go back on all these things. I'm not seeing that yet.
And while mentioning EPP and CDU, we know that they haven't been supportive of the green policies, as you said. Do you think her decision to pull back the Green Deal was affected by her attempt to maintain the support of her party?
I think so. And I think in particular that her party, her own party, the CDU, which decided in the end with their national manifesto to stick with a call to reverse the combustion engine car ban, I think that the pressure was coming in particular from her party in Germany. But knowing von der Leyen, she also obviously is very much interested in retaining voter support and being all very agreeable and presidential. So she knows what voters are looking at at the moment. She's seen farmers protest all over Europe.
And we have seen that she has already changed her tone while addressing the farmers. She's now trying to bring them in the center of attention.
Our farmers deserve to be listened to. I know that they are worried about the future of agriculture and about their future as farmers. But they also know that agriculture needs to move to a more sustainable model of production so that their farms remain profitable in the years to come.
The farmers' protest probably is one of the most significant topics, although they're already not so present in the media anymore. But I think in Brussels, people still talk about them. That you have Macron, who decided to run for his party with a candidate who was branded as farmer friendly. So even liberal parties are aware that there's a demographic which may not be so big in the end, but which can make the main parties look pretty bad with their protests. The sort of how do we appease the farmers? That will play a role. So it will be a mix, I think, of her party being if you're running as our candidate, please, make some concessions, and her being maybe I should talk about other things because otherwise people won't actually vote for me.
And what are the other key areas in which she's trying to appease the right?
She's seen that people are talking about migration. She's seen the backlash against green policies in her own native country, Germany. Mm-hmm. Von der Leyen has been traveling a lot to Northern Africa to talk to countries about managing migration towards the EU. And I think she will hold that one up quite a bit.
It is very important for me because irregular migration is a European challenge and it needs a European answer. So we are in this together.
Mentioned Ursula von der Leyen during her visit to Lampedusa last September amidst a crisis sparked by a sudden surge in refugee arrivals on the island.
And finally, defense. Von der Leyen is taking a stance on that, saying we need a defense commissioner. She also her commission just published a strategy on the defense industry for the EU. So you can see that these talking points are the ones that I think where they're trying to get the right on board.
And while she's trying to appease the right, there is a question about the left, which doesn't sound as impressed by her actions. How does she plan to maintain the support of the left? What cards can she put on the table?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure anyone has thought about that too much at this point, because what I told you earlier, that we're having this sort of rhetorical balance, talking a bit about left right-wing topics and phrasing them in a way that makes them sound Euro-friendly. Mm-hmm. That is what we're seeing at the moment. But the question is, will that be enough? Because I think what the left are mainly worried about is that von der Leyen will start colluding with parties to her right after the election. Not so much what she talks about right now, but things like, is she going to collaborate with Giorgia Meloni, Italy's formerly deemed post-fascist prime minister? And the Social Democrats in particular have said if any ECR parties or ID parties are involved in any post-election negotiations, we're going to be out. Just today, we had an interview published of the new delegation leader of the German Social Democrats, who said, we're looking at sort of a period in opposition, so to speak, in the European Parliament on the left. We will need to say no to von der Leyen more often to make it clear that we're not going to be her fig leaf to make her look pro-European, but we're actually backing up her working with the right. That's not going to happen. So what I'm wondering is, what can she offer the left beyond kind words to reassure them about plans of collaborating with Meloni, for example?
And you're mentioning the collaboration with Giorgia Meloni, but her partner in the Italian government and the leader of Lega, Matteo Salvini, expressed his disappointment regarding her bid for a second term.
Gli italiani che sceglieranno la Lega non sceglieranno mai un altro mandato per Ursula von der Leyen.
And said that his party won't support another VDL term. And Matteo Salvini isn't the only one, so what is the reason for this?
This is a very interesting thing here, I think, because it's no surprise that Italy's far-right parties, such as, Lega, where Salvini is from, or the Polish PiS, or the French Rassemblement National, that they don't like von der Leyen. What I find very interesting is that they talk about her so much, because normally from European election campaigns, what we're used to is that people try to talk about their own national governments. They're like, oh, we don't like Macron, we don't like Olaf Scholz, we don't like Giorgia Meloni, though this would be hard for the Lega here. It's quite unusual that they're talking about von der Leyen so much. We're seeing it on social media. Rassemblement was very outspoken about being against von der Leyen specifically. And what I think is behind this are two things. First of all, the European election is more salient than ever before, and I think they think their voters know who von der Leyen is, and they can score points at her expense. That is new. And then the second thing is that she is the first European Commission President who's actually running for re-election. Her predecessor, Juncker, who was the first Spitzenkandidat, lead candidate, and won an election, he didn't run for a second election, right? So von der Leyen is the first Spitzenkandidat who's running for a second term and thus has a record to defend. And so it's easier for far-right parties to attack her because there's a record that they can attack.
And there are some voices saying that Ursula von der Leyen is leaning towards the right-wing policies. However, there are some other voices that say that she is not right-wing enough. Can you tell us a bit more on this?
I think left-wing parties, as I said earlier, have identified her leaning towards the right in her campaign against the Green Deal, against more migration, or rather, in favor of stricter management. And her dropping clues about Meloni, they have identified that as a weakness that they can use with their core voter base to be like, look what von der Leyen is doing. You need to vote now, or otherwise we're going to have a right-wing, quote-unquote, government in Europe. I think left-wing parties think they can score points with their voters on this. And the second thing is that will be the right-wing parties, as I just said, who have a record to attack. And that record looks quite green, quite centrist. She was also unfortunate enough to have some great crises with regard to migration and Europe's defense fall into her term, meaning there's some material to point to von der Leyen and be like, she's not conservative enough. Look what has happened under her watch. So as many centrists, von der Leyen struggles to get both sides of the spectrum in alignment with her. It also means that she, being right in the center, can get quite a few voters on both sides as well. So you have to look at it that way too. And so let's see if this is going to be a weakness or strength.
And Nick, if you were to wrap up this topic with a message, what would that be?
Short message would be question mark, because we still don't really know if any of this will matter at all this time. I told you that right-wing parties apparently think they can score points with von der Leyen, but I'm not too sure that the campaign will matter even this time with the far-right shift being discussed so much. Because, it's April and we're already facing up to the election in June, and everywhere it still seems a bit quiet. And von der Leyen doesn't really plan to campaign until May, as we revealed ourselves. So at the moment, I guess the question is, will anything that happens during this campaign really matter for the final result? Is this European election really going to be different? And is it really going to be about European topics rather than national ones this time? And only then will we know if von der Leyen will actually solve this puzzle that she's being confronted with, and if it will matter at all.
Thank you very much, Nick, for sharing with us your insights. I am Evi Kiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Sainz de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in, and we will be back tomorrow morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.